It's Nikki, and this is how to challenge your guests without losing that tip. The customer is not always right. In fact, in my experience, they're very often dead wrong. Often we get so angry with travelers for behaving badly in our cities and in our countries. Yet I wonder if someone simply pointed that out to them, they would behave better. And, what is considered acceptable behavior varies drastically depending on the culture. So, is it even perhaps a bit unrealistic of us to expect all travelers to take the time and energy to observe and mimic the locals? They could, but I don't know, is that a lot to ask? And I just feel that guides are in the perfect position to educate travelers on what not to do. However, with our customer service tendencies, we are often so afraid of insulting guests or losing that tip, honestly, that we're much more likely to smile and nod rather than call them out on bad behavior. So in this article, I will offer a few suggestions on how to gain the confidence to correct your guests as needed, which your fellow locals will thank you for. So, first, you can reframe the question. If you don't like the question they've asked, if it's ignorant, for example, or rude without them realizing, just reframe it. For example, let's say your guest has asked if you are married, which you might be very uncomfortable answering. You could reframe the question by saying, oh, in our culture, we never talk about personal things like that on the job, but I can tell you that most people nowadays get married in their late 20s. Right? So you're giving them an answer and also politely hinting that you cannot give that information. You can also tell them why something they're doing is inappropriate. This is really important to give them context. In New York City, where locals are famous for always being in a hurry, travelers can sometimes be offended when they get pushed. And then, of course, on our end, we're annoyed that the travelers are in the way, right, and taking up space. So I used to call attention to this really easily on any walking tour by saying something like, now we're going to be going at a bit of a slower pace than the locals, so let's just make sure to stay to the right so that others can pass us. And if someone pushes by, just remember, you're here on vacation, but they're trying to get to work or they're trying to get home after a long day, right? Just to put it into context. You also need to understand your audience. This is pretty obvious, but I think we forget that the majority of people who sign up for a tour do so to learn something, right? So they're usually more open than others to being educated. However, there are of course those guests who are only on the tour because their family is, or they're the type of person that feels they need to show off how much they know. We all know those guests. So by getting to know your guests, right, talking to them before the tour starts, during check-in, between stops, you can get a better idea of who is open to being corrected and who is not. So when the time comes, you can easily make that decision of whether to speak up or not. And finally, embrace your role as a local ambassador, right? Don't forget that you are the local expert in this scenario. Make it easier for travelers to blend in by educating your guests on local customs that they can utilize throughout their visit. For example, a guide in Italy might explain to American tourists that in a local coffee shop, you must often pay first and then bring your receipt to the person at the bar. That's very opposite from how it's done over here. And when you explain that on the tour, it's simply an interesting cultural fact. However, it has a huge impact in later preventing those exact guests from getting in the way of locals, right? And angering locals by them, trying to order their coffee with the barista instead of going to pay first. I've written about this a lot, so some articles you could check out of mine I've linked to. One is how to be political on a tour, and the other is my favorite formula for changing the perspectives of your guests.